These are African rhythms, passed down to us through ancient spirits. Feel the spirit, a unifying force. Come on, move with the spirit. Stand up, clap your hands.
From WSNC 90.5 FM, a broadcasting service of Winston-Salem State University, welcome to Africa Will Now Project. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. Today, we will listen to part one of a conversation I recently had with Professor Fred Moten, where we explored the Undercommons and 21st century resistance. Africa World Now Project is next. Black radicalism, consequently, cannot be understood within the particular context of its genesis. It is not a variant of Western radicalism, whose proponents happen to be black. Rather, it is a specifically African response to the oppression emergent from the immediate determinants of European development in the modern era, and framed by orders of human exploitation woven into the interstices of European social life from the inception of Western civilization. Cedric Robinson, Black Marxism. How do we map the Black radical tradition? How can we understand its praxis? If we are truly to refashion the world, to make it better, to remake its institutions, to address its systemic inequalities, find justice, seek peace, what language can we use to transmit it once we are able to see it? What are the concepts that it will produce that would allow us to see the world differently? How can we codify the thoughts and practices in an effort to create a new vision of the world while simultaneously resisting the present? What questions do we need to ask that begins to provide insight and foresight to muddle through the man versus human conflict explored in the work of Sylvia Wynter? Aimé Césaire argues that we cannot look to Western notions of man, as this man has been forged out of an arrested understanding of humanity, a narrow conception which consistently depends on the systematic degradation of non-European men and women. He writes in Discourse on Colonialism, at the very time when it most often mouths the word, the West has never been further from being able to live a true humanism, a humanism made to the measure of the world. More than this, where do we look? Fred Moten and Stefano Harney suggest that we pay closer attention to the Undercommons. It is the space in between space that we should look to study blackness. According to Jack Halberstam in Chapter 0 of the Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study, if you want to know what the Undercommons want, what Moten and Harney want, what black people, indigenous people, queer and poor people want, what we, the we who cohabit in this space of the Undercommons want, it is this. We cannot be satisfied with the recognition and acknowledgement generated by the very system that denies A, that anything was ever broken, and B, that we deserve to be the broken part. So we refuse to ask for recognition, and instead we want to take apart, dismantle, tear down the structure that right now limits our ability to find each other, to see beyond it, and to access the places that we know lie outside its walls. Today, Africa World Now Project will present a recent conversation I had with Professor Fred Moten, where we explore the ideas set forth by radical thinkers ranging from anti-colonialists such as Sylvia Wynter and Aimé Césaire to scholar activists such as W.E.B. Du Bois and Amiri Baraka. Professor Fred Moten is currently Professor of English at the University of California, Riverside, where he teaches courses and conducts research in Black Studies, Performance Studies, Poetics, and Literary Theory. He is author of In the Break, The Aesthetics of the Black Radical Tradition, B. Jenkins, The Field Trio, which was a poetry finalist for the National Book Award and Los Angeles Times Book Prize and winner of the California Book Award for Poetry, The Little Edges, which was a finalist for the Kingsley Tufts Poetry Award, and The Service Porch, a Poetics of the Undercommons, and a 3-volume collection of essays whose general title is Consent Not to Be a Single Being. Moten is co-author with Stefano Harney of the Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study. Our show was produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Cooperative Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, and Ghana, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all people. Enjoy the program. Thank you for taking the time to join us today, Professor Moten. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing very well. And thank you for, again, you're out on the West Coast right now. And of course, you know, there's about 3 hours of difference. And so it's generally early in the day for you. So you're just getting started.
Oh, no, it's my pleasure. I appreciate the chance to talk to you.
Great. So let's jump right into the conversation that I wanted to have with you. And we'll start with just a basic question. What is the Undercommons? And you write a lot about this in your work, and of people that probably are familiar with your work, but there are also people who are not so familiar with your work. What is the Undercommons?
Well, the Undercommons is first of all, it's an idea or a way of describing a certain kind of mode of social life that is the product of a long time collaboration with my friend Stefano Harney, who I went to college with and who I've known for 35 years now. So the Undercommons is an idea that emerged out of, you know, this sort of long collaborative study, hanging out, walking, talking, drinking, you know, thinking out loud with my friend. And in a lot of ways, the Undercommons is a way of describing not only this broader social activity that we are interested in, but it's also a way of describing, you know, the way in which the very idea came about, or at least the way that this description of the idea came about. It's one simple formulation of it is that the Undercommons is a form of active intellectual life, active cultural and aesthetic life, and social life that people do when they're together with one another. And you know, it's the life that we lead and that we build with one another. And it's usually best understood as a life that we lead and that we build outside of or underneath the general accepted legitimate sort of zones of normal political economic activity. So it's underneath in a certain way the activities of the state, and it's underneath the activities of capital. And when I say underneath, I mean that it is both underground in relation to those realms, but it also operates underneath them insofar as it is in the shadow of those zones of activity, and it is moving in a kind of fugitive way in relation to those activities. It's everything we do, I would say, when we're trying our best to live out from under the oppressive, you know, structures of the state and capital. So
you write about, and obviously you think about the Undercommons as a non-place, a space that has no need for spaces or property or the nation state. It's an idea, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, it's an idea of a creation of a new society. How do we get there given our current historical and social political moment? And moreover, how serious does the work need to be in replacing our current economic system that bolsters our current social, political, and cultural moment?
Well, in a way, the answer to the question of how we get there is, I mean, I would say I had to be one of those annoying people who answers a question with a question. Mm-hmm. So I would say it's not so much how do we get there, but how do we realize that we are there, that in a certain sense we've never left there, that our most genuine and our most intense and pleasurable activities actually already occur within the structure of the Undercommons. And it's in those moments again when we exist in flight from, and also at the same time in a fight with, the normal, again, activities and structures of the state and capital. But we do those things all the time. We do those things all the time. And the question that emerges then is like, how do we recognize that we're doing those things? How do we learn to pay attention to what we're doing, and to honor what it is that we're doing, and even to study what it is that we do, and how do we learn to, in spite of all the reasons why it seems as if we need always to be paying attention to what our enemies do, how do we deflect some of that attention, some of that critical attention from what our enemies do, so that we can pay some attention to what we do, and so that we can pay some attention to it that allows us actually to figure out a way to defend it, against, the forces that seek to swallow it and to consume it and to exploit it and to trade it and to steal it. So I hope I'm not trying to be evasive. I'm just saying that it's something that, the Undercommons is here. And I'm thinking about this specifically in relation to Black social life, although, I don't know that it's exclusive to Black social life, but that's certainly the realm within which Stefano Harney and I were primarily concerned with it. And that was the realm that we were choosing to try to study and to try to understand.
Well, you raised the point. Specifically, you mentioned earlier a mode of social life, and you also mentioned some of the activities, the human activities, and you also talked about this idea of recognizing that we're already there. And I think that is a very, very important point of kind of archiving or documenting the daily lives, but also the way that we tend to resist certain modes of production or certain forms of capital that kind of reaches down to kind of structure our social life, but also the way our thinking, our processes of thinking, thinking of how we think, kind of questioning. Because what I hear right now is that it's almost like curating this space that we're already in, but allowing this space to actually flourish or to be more out in the open. Within the context of this recognition, this recognition becomes important because, this recognition of a history of Black people, right? This recognition of being recognized by others. It's Black life within itself. Am I correct?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that, well, you used the word curating, which is a cool word, and I'm really interested in that word, although maybe in a slight variation on that term, in the sense that, what it is that a curator is now, within the context of the art world and the academic world is, as an individual who makes a series of, essentially, authoritarian decisions about what to exhibit, what to show, what to pay attention to. And I'm not so much interested in what it would mean to be a curator in that way, but I am interested in what it would mean to be a curate, in that old, sort of, religious sense of the term, where a curate is just a priest, a relatively lowly figure within the church hierarchy, but the one who, contrary to the more, temporary, fleeting, pastoral care that a bishop or would give. Let's say a curate is that's the person who visits the sick. That's the person who engages in the day-to-day pastoral care of a parish. And in this respect, curacy is a form of care, and so I think what we need to be able to do is to both study and recognize these historical forms of care that we have constantly been engaged in, and then at the same time to figure out new ways to show that care, new ways to advance those forms of care within, the new, structures that we are constrained also to live within. So it is a form, it's care is the key, that's the key. And again, it's not so much for me in terms of bringing it out in the open so that it can be seen by the rest of the world as much, but it is about caring in such a way as to allow us to remain open to ourselves, to allow us to maintain that openness that we show to ourselves, even though at the same time, that openness is what constantly makes us vulnerable to incursion, to invasion, to all kinds of horrific and brutal forms of imperial, disruption and accumulation. So that's the paradox. How is it the paradox that I guess Stefano and I have been particularly interested in is how it is that these forms of care and these forms of openness within our own social structure actually constitute the surest and most reliable forms of self-defense. So one way to put it is that, the practices that we seek to defend, we can only defend by engaging we defend those practices by engaging in them. And this is an insight that I learned from the work of this very brilliant Palestinian architect and architectural critic and theorist named Sandi Hilal, in the work that she does with a group of architects in Palestine called Design Art Architecture Residency, DAAR. But that notion in the Arabic term that they use to describe this form of self-defense by practicing the thing you want to defend is al-masha. It's a form of collective cultivation that people engage in, where again the notion of cultivation is very close to this notion of care or curacy that we were just talking about. So yeah.
And actually this form of care and this openness and this collective cultivation that you're talking about actually leads to me thinking about how do African diasporic communities articulate this, or how do they articulate the commons, and in the same vein, what is our role as people of African descent, but also African people, in relation? What is our relationship and responsibility to land and the environment in this particular moment as well?
One way to think about it is there's certain questions that I've been interested in that I feel like people should, but they often they don't come to us often. Maybe I shouldn't put it that way. How can I put it? I just been interested every once in a while, you're interested in a certain thing and you pay attention to that thing, but then there's another moment at which you still are you realize that you have to be concerned with how this thing happened. Mm-hmm. Because it seems as if everything that we've learned and everything that we've, studied seems to indicate that the thing that we're paying attention to was actually impossible, and yet we know that it happened. So let's talk about the struggle for Black liberation in the United States, and maybe more specifically, particularly in the Southern United States. And we could say that this is this broad struggle that includes, two primary sort of historical nodes. One, maybe, well, three, just the entire structure and energy that goes into that operates under the framework of abolitionism, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And where when I say abolitionism, I don't mean, firebrand orators, either white or Black, in the North, who are exhorting people about the necessity of the abolition of slavery. I mean the everyday work of abolition that the people who were enslaved themselves engaged in constantly, ceaselessly, as a function of their commitment to their own collective survival. Okay, that's what I understand abolitionism to be, and that shows up for me as a set of practices. So if we think about the history of abolitionism or the history of Black liberation struggle, and then we could associate it with certain, eruptive events, Reconstruction or the second Reconstruction that sometimes people also refer to as the Civil Rights Movement. One of the things that I think is really important to understand is, well, how is it that these things happen? Given the complete brutality, given the forms of seemingly total control, okay, that the state and capital and whiteness exerted over Blackness in the periods that within the context of Afro-American history, how did such a movement exist? How did it operate? How did it survive? How does it still survive given the constraints that we live under? And to ask that question is really to ask, for me at least, is to ask the question concerning the nature and the origin, so to speak, of the undercommons. Mm-hmm. And the undercommons is not a commons in the way that we would ordinarily associate it with a certain notion of collective ownership that citizens, even of the lowliest type, might engage in common with their fellow citizens. Because we're not citizens of this place, not really. We never have been. Mm-hmm. Our citizenship has always been interdicted. Our claim on the collective ownership of the country, so to speak, has always been interdicted. And I would argue that it is not only has it always been interdicted, but it has also generally always been refused by us because we were interested in something else, something better than that. We didn't just want to be included in this thing as it is already structured, because we knew that the way that this thing was already structured was based upon our exclusion, right? That was a logical fallacy that we could ever be citizens of this place, So for me, and it doesn't mean that there aren't some Black people who want to claim citizenship or who want to perform citizenship in certain ways. And I'm not denouncing them or calling them, traitors or Uncle Toms or anything like that. I'm interested in the work that they do because I feel like the vestiges and the traces of the work of the Undercommons animates their work too. So, and there are ways in which I'm constantly engaged in activities that might be conceived of and that ought to be conceived of as, some, whatever you want to call it, temporary performances of citizenship. Sometimes I vote, I work for the state. They give me a paycheck, all those things. But what I'm very interested in, what I'm primarily interested in, is this general thrust and this general tendency we have towards the refusal of those forms of citizenship and ownership that characterize, sort of normative American personhood. And I've just always been interested in something deeper than that. And I've always been interested in how, what I understand, that I've always been interested in how, for me, Black culture is the expression of a desire for something other than that, something more than that.
Mm-hmm. So what I'm hearing here is there's a couple of things. There's a couple of themes of the ways of knowing, and you mentioned the nature of the undercommons. And so what I'm hearing here is that you're interested in that space, that the dialectic of belonging and not belonging to at the same time creates this space of being property, but then being granted so-called citizenship. You're interested in how people move, how they think, and also their activities, and understanding, their own space within this space.
Well, I guess it's not so much, for me at least, what it means to live, inside that space that the dialectic of belonging and non-belonging creates, as much as it would be trying to imagine, what's outside of that dialectic, what's outside of that space. But that also means in a very, and I don't know, maybe people might get sick of, for me, these are sort of technical kind of questions. I don't mean to get too picky about it, but it's not just that one wants to imagine a space outside of that which is structured by the dialectic between belonging and non-belonging. It's also that the structure of the dialectic of belonging and non-belonging in some ways determines the very idea of space that we're trying to operate within, or that emerges as a sort of frame for this kind of discussion. And so for me, it's not just about a disruption of that dialectic of belonging and non-belonging. It's about a way of thinking. Again, as you pointed out earlier in the conversation, it's a way of thinking about the undercommons as something other than a space. To think about it rather as a practice, and as a kind of activity. And in this respect, maybe for me, I wouldn't so much sort of place it, like I said, within that tension between belonging and non-belonging, but rather to say the term that sometimes Stefano and I use is, some dispossession. What it means to that the key structure, the key activity that we're engaged in, is a form of giving, a form of sharing, that kind of openness that we share with one another. That's what it is. That's what that practice really is sharing. And so it is a practice which creates this very rich and beautiful paradox, which is that the way you protect what it is that you have is by giving it away, is by sharing it. You protect it by giving it away.
Which is interesting because of course, you and Stefano also write about the university, right? This idea of sharing and giving it away. I mean, so knowledge is also a commodity in a capitalist system that creates and reproduces actually forms of marginalization oftentimes, because you mentioned just now, sometimes we get into our technical jargon, our intellectual jargon that kind of loses people in certain spaces that they do not have access to certain journals or certain books, but they also live most of the stuff that we talk about or that we think about on a day-to-day basis. So then, to me, it seems like how we're trying to capture this non-linear form of creation, of ways of thinking, of ways of knowing, of ways of being, in response to, but also not necessarily always in response to, but also as a creation of another way of thinking or another society. So how can we understand knowledge production in relation to this, in that particular context, to the modern university, which attempts to commodify or to place this idea of knowledge in a very, very commodified form?
Well, I mean, I think that people form their own technical languages and their own jargons to describe, what it is that they do. And they do so within the context that they operate within, and the university is a particular context that operates in particular ways that, you describe by way of the term commodification, and the plantation was also a place for the production of knowledge and the production of subjectivity, the production of a certain notion of what it is to be a person. I mean, that's what the university is. It's a place where knowledge is produced, and it's one way to think about it is a place where self-knowledge is produced. But the plantation was that too. The factory was that too. And people who engaged in certain kinds of work on the plantation or certain kinds of work in the factory, they developed technical languages that were structured in relation to the activities that they had to engage in on a day-to-day basis. And that's no different than what happens in the university. And what ends up, and of course, part of what, under those constraints, all those different kinds of technical language, contribute to the richness of our common, intellectual endowment. So I don't, people, so a lot of people worried, me and Stefano, we were interested in the university because that's where we work.
Mm-hmm.
The same way that, if you listen to, my mother was a school teacher. She talked about school all the time because that was where she worked. She wanted her working conditions to be better. My father was a bus driver, And he talked about driving the bus and the conditions under which he drove the bus. And when he got together with Mr. Ridley, who lived across the street, who also drove the bus, sometimes I would listen to them talk when I was growing up, and I understood some of what they were saying, and some of it I didn't, because sometimes they would break into the technical jargon that was common to them as bus drivers, right? You see? So I don't know. And the only issue, and my kids are deeply concerned with stuff that goes on at their school, and they're deeply concerned with playing the violin now. That's what they're interested in, and they play the violin at their school. And it doesn't take but about 5 minutes before they enter into forms of technical jargon that I don't get, I don't understand, because I'm not a musician at their level. I'm interested in what they do. And so I say, well, what y'all talking about? Explain that to me. I don't know what this means. And I feel like, and then in this respect, we share languages with one another. We share, these ways of talking and ways of thinking. And I think we're all concerned. They're concerned with making music. They're concerned with making something beautiful. They're concerned with stuff being fun. They want to make something together. That was a concern that my mom had when she was talking about teaching. That's a concern that Stefano and I have when we talk about teaching where we teach. They were concerned with making the conditions and the structures within which they work better. They wanted to live in a better way. So we share these general common concerns, and we have a whole bunch of different languages that we also share when we try to talk and think through those things. So I tend to think about it that way, rather than thinking about the university as a kind of, monolithic, monstrous structure, which is trying to get us to think of, the university is a horrific, brutal structure, but its horror and its brutality doesn't work that way. Where there's some people sitting in a room deciding how they will get us to think to turn knowledge into a commodity. They tend to operate in terms of the way in which they are deeply committed to accessing and accumulating and exploiting the stuff that we do, when we are not underneath their supervision, right? In a lot of ways, their capacity to accumulate depends upon our creative capacity to deviate, from a set of already given and normative structures. And often they figure out ways both to encourage that, and at the same time as they also figure out ways to regulate that. It's the monstrosity of the university, like the monstrosity of the plantation, operates in a way that's more subtle than folks tend to. It's almost as if, because we don't pay close enough attention to what we do, we hamstring our capacity to pay close enough attention to what they do. Okay, because they have to be a whole lot more subtle in the ways in which in the ways in which their genocidal activities are carried out, because they have to match the subtlety with which we carry out our capacities and structures of survival and living. They got to be a little bit deeper than we think they are, because we're a whole lot deeper than we think we are, it seems to me.
Yes. We are the hallucination. We are the evolution, the continuation. We are the hallucination. Our DNA is of earth and sky. Our DNA is of past and future. The people, the people, the people, the people. The virus took on many shapes. The bear, the elk, the antelope, the elephant, the deer, the mineral, the iron, the copper, the coltan, the rubber, the coffee, the cotton, the sugar. The people, the people, the people, the people. The germ traveled faster than the bullet. They harvest the mountainside, protect the crops, herd the cattle.
We You're listening to a recent conversation I had with Professor Fred Moten, where we are exploring the ideas set forth by radical thinkers, ranging from anti-colonialists such as Sylvia Wynter and Aimé Césaire, to scholar activists such as W.B. Du Bois and Amir Baraka. Professor Fred Moten is currently professor of English at the University of California, Riverside, where he teaches courses and conducts research in Black studies, performance studies, poetics, and literary theory. He is author of In the Break, The Aesthetics of the Black Radical Tradition, and numerous other work, to include being co-author with Stefano Harney of the Undercommons, Fugitive Planning in Black Study. Our show was produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, and Ghana, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all people. Please continue to enjoy the program. No, that's a very, very important point. This idea of paying attention to what they do as opposed to paying attention to the creative processes of our own lives. And I wanted to kind of pull on this strand of deviation, or this thought process of deviation. What do you think your work situates in Black studies or Africana studies, or African American studies, or however we tend to coin it? I tend to coin it as Africana studies. But what is the role of Black studies in this particular environment? Because you talked about deviation. We know the history of Black studies being introduced, being as an insurgent intellectual project into the academy. And if we were to look at, or to get a little microscopic view, or take it under the microscope for a second, what is the role of Black studies in this conversation?
I mean, well, Black studies, I don't know that it was, I don't know that it was ever meant. Maybe it was meant this way by some people. Maybe some people really did believe that the role of Black studies was to inject a certain kind of insurgency within the university. I know that there are critics of Black studies who believed that Black studies was having such an insurgent and maybe corrosive effect on the university. Thinkers like Hannah Arendt and other folks who expressed all kinds of alarm about the student movement in the 60s and 70s, and who traced, the origins of their alarm back to the emergence of Black studies in the university. They thought about it that way. I don't know. I don't know that that's the right way. I know that that the structure, that the university, as well as people who, were engaged in the various forms of funding research in the university, and this is work that scholars like Nick Mitchell and, oh man, I'm getting old, so I can't remember names anymore, but, oh goodness. Noliwe Rooks, scholars like Rooks and Mitchell have written about this, along with many other people. Roderick Ferguson. These are folks who have paid attention to the ways that it turns out that the very institutional structures that Black studies is supposed to have some kind of corrosive effect upon were the structures that funded Black studies and ushered it into the university. So did these structures want to bring Black studies into the university because they thought Black studies was going to destroy the university? Or did they want to bring Black studies into the university because they thought that the university would be able to regulate Black studies, right? Mm-hmm. These are important historical questions that people have now begun to take up. My tendency is to want to, in a certain sense, step back a little bit and kind of detach the history of Black studies from the history of the university. In the same way that I would detach the history of Black study from the history of the plantation. Black study, occurs in the university, as well. And it also occurs for instance, it occurred and probably, and in the Ford, motor company plants in River Rouge outside of Detroit, when the League of Revolutionary Black Workers were, in their heyday. It occurred in factories. It occurred, on jitney stands, in the way that August Wilson writes about in his plays. Black study occurs, in kitchens, when Black women who are cleaning up white women's houses get together and talk about what they do. Black study occurs within the context of all those institutional structures, but it is not determined by those institutional structures. It is constrained by those structures. It is, shaped in some ways by those structures, but it's not determined by those structures. And its origins, it doesn't owe its origins to the force of those structures. So I'm interested in Black study as something which, yes, certainly occurs within those structures, but it's not reducible to those structures. So for me, I'm interested in how Black studies operates in the university, because that's part of what it is that I'm engaged in. That's my job. But I'm also interested in something that I would detach from Black studies and call Black study. And I'm interested in how Black study is ultimately, again, as I said, not determined by the institutional structures within which it operates. Mm-hmm. It's something that happens on the corner. It's something that happens in church. It's something that happens, when kids are walking together to school. Those are also, really important, the most important places where Black study occurs. And I'm interested in and I want to figure out ways to engage with and to join along with the activity that occurs in those places. Mm-hmm. So
that creation, it seems like, the idea of the processes of creation, what is the origin of certain thoughts and certain behaviors, separate from responding to institutions all the time. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, we operate under constraints, and that's just a fact and a simple truism, but we are not reducible to those constraints. We don't always, everything we do is not always in response to this man and his institutions, and when we situate and when we began to conceive of what we do as always being in response, as always being reactive to what he does, then I think that places us in a position of even greater vulnerability than the one that we generally inhabit.
It's not generative. It doesn't allow agency. It doesn't allow the full expression of one's agency.
Well, I wouldn't even think about it in terms of the full expression of one's agency. Mm-hmm. For me, the very idea of the full expression of one's agency, that's a formation that operates. That's a formation that emerges as a kind of, let's say, that's a collage of certain key concepts and terms within the Western philosophical tradition that ultimately, I think, does nobody on the earth any good. The very idea of one, the idea of agency being associated with a one, mm-hmm. the idea of full expression being a kind of thing that a single one or an individuated, person does. All those things seem to me to be problematic formulations that Black study is constantly trying to move through and to work through and to disavow and to refuse. So I wouldn't put it that way. But what I would say is that in a lot of ways, one possible formulation would simply be that the very idea that what we are concerned with is achieving the full expression of our individual agency, that is already hopelessly, bound up in the activity of responding to this man, and responding to him in the language that he has imposed, So, and like I said, I don't, I can't, that's about as much that's about as strongly as I'll go in the direction of critique, let's say. And what would exist on the other side of that thing that I'm being critical of there is a function of some common study that we all engage in. I just don't think that I don't know, when I would go driving around with my grandmother in Arkansas taking her to church because she played the piano at some church or other every day, and I would drive her around in my grandfather's old Buick Skylark, and I would be fascinated and studying and trying to pay attention to what was going on in these churches way out in the woods, and I don't think my sense of it is that what was going on in those churches was never about the individual expression of a kind of full and complete agency. It was just deeper than that. It was way deeper than that. Those are not accurate terms to use to describe what it is that people were engaged in those places, and what it is that they were engaged in the way that they worked every day and tried to figure out ways to provide for themselves and to provide for one another. I don't know what the proper words are to describe it, but I would say that the Undercommons is this gesture that we have made towards a better description. Is it complete and absolute and perfect? No, not by any means. But that's a term that we came up with as a way of trying to describe this thing that we were interested in, that, the old concepts of individual agency and self-expression did not approach in anything like an adequate way.
So, for me, it seems that you're trying to provide a lens to see beyond these structures, to see that place beyond, even though we don't necessarily have the language or the words, but it's in us. Is that what we're saying? It's in us. It's in us already. So the collective. I hear some collectivity here. It's almost like seeing a level of a reconnection of our humanity, continuities in our humanity.
Yeah. And I think I was misleading a little while ago when I was saying, well, maybe people don't want to necessarily hear the sort of technical pickiness with which I would say it. It's just that, but oftentimes like my cousins would be working on a car and they would start moving into realms of technical pickiness with the language that they use to describe what was going on in the car that I could, either take or leave depending on how much I wanted to go play basketball or something like that, So anyway, what I'm trying to say is like, humanity, I don't know. I don't know if this is a reconnection to humanity. I would tend to want to think about it more as a reconnection to the earth. And that brings us back to that question about land that you mentioned that I kind of didn't quite get at before, a few minutes ago. But I wouldn't say it's about so much the idea of man or of the human. There's a great thinker, maybe one of our greatest living thinkers in our tradition, certainly one of the greatest living thinkers in our tradition, named Sylvia Wynter, who talks about, she makes a crucial distinction between what she calls human and the human and man. That man is a European self-conception that is predicated on our exclusion from it, and she wants to reactivate this notion of the human against the grain of those exclusions, which she talks about using the term overrepresentation. European man represents himself as if he were the human, and she calls that an overrepresentation. And so what I would want to, and so she wants to offer a critical understanding of this notion of the overrepresentation of man in the interest of reclaiming the human as a general framework that we all live within. And in this respect, her work is very much like an echo of, Frantz Fanon's work in that respect. I don't know. I'm not so sanguine about the human as she is. My sense of it is that when we make appeals to humanity in that way, it always occurs within the framework of a distancing of ourselves from that which exists as the non-human, on Earth. And the ecological disaster that we find ourselves in seems to me to be in many ways a function of that distancing. And that distancing of the human from the earth always also manifests itself as an assertion of dominion of the human over the earth. And we need to relinquish that dominion. You know, we haven't done a good job with it, you know?
Yeah.
We would get fired, you know, like Phil Jackson, you know what I'm saying? We haven't run the earth very well. We've run the earth into the ground. And in some ways that exists as a function of our differentiation of ourselves from the earth. And so what I would want to do is to renew this general common understanding of the earthly in ways that maybe wouldn't necessarily be so bound up with trying to reclaim or reconnect to our humanity. But with all that said, yeah, what I'm talking about is definitely something that you could talk about under the rubric of a kind of collectivity or a commonness or an undercommonness, you know, that you know, the deepest possible commonness that we share, not only with one another as human beings, but also that we share with the ground, that we share with the air, that we share with the water and the birds and the rocks, you know, that's the undercommonness, and that's that general kind of entanglement that I'm invested in, and that the work I've been doing with my friends, you know, that's what we're invested in.
So it's something within the context of Black expressive culture. That you're looking at as well. Could you talk a little bit more about that lens through which you are providing a framework to kind of, because interestingly enough, I think within the context of that connectedness to land, because if we look at capitalism, its idea of creation is also to conquer nature. You know, that idea to conquer inanimate objects and then infuse a certain form of labor in that particular process. So Black expressive culture provides a lens that we can we can pick up on those little nuances, what I would call the little movements of human activity. You know, so what is it in Black expressive culture that you see that can help us kind of expand or explain what the Undercommons looks like?
Well, I mean, it's just it's, you know, just as you say, there are these small practices of sharing and collaboration, you know, and there are, and I believe that Black expressive culture is, you know, a haven or a refuge where these practices are, you know, honored. And they are honored in their observance. You know, they are honored and protected in the practice of them. And so when I am studying Black expressive culture, that's what I'm looking for. Often those forms of expressive culture that honor and practice and preserve, you know, these forms of sharing, they take the form, you know, at least in an outward way of response to brutality, response to oppression, response to having been accumulated, and those responses are fundamentally important parts of what that expressive culture does. But at the same time, at the most basic level, for me, the most important level, those forms of expressive culture that also could be said to offer a critical response, you know, to dominance. The most important aspects of those forms of expressive culture are something other than merely a response, something more than just a response. They are, in fact, what I'm most engaged in and what I'm most interested in paying attention to are the sort of formal, practical elements of Black expressive culture that manifest themselves as sharing and communication and communicability and openness within our own thing. I'm interested in how the band interacts, and I'm interested in how those forms of interaction actually constitute for us a model of how stuff should be all the time. So that's why I study it, you know. That's why I study it.
So breaking these particular, and I was sitting here thinking, and I was looking at, you know, instances that we have seen exactly what we are laying out in this conversation, and I'm thinking about you know, the art form or the Black classical music, what we generally refer to as jazz, and I'm also thinking about, you know, its evolution specifically in that particular period of what is generally referred to as that free jazz. I'm thinking about those particular spontaneous creations moving out of these particular structures. And I'm thinking about, I mean, is that what we will see? Is that a close, approximate description of what we're talking about here, but also again attempting to move beyond this? But is that a good analogy to kind of look at, to get people to kind of think about what we're talking about, to give them a picture of how it looks, even though we're talking about something that goes beyond? But is that a clear enough picture that we can offer our listeners?
Well, I would say, you know, look, I mean, I'm really interested in art, and sometimes I think that that's okay, and then every once in a while I start to get suspicious of it. There's a really great book by this great scholar named Clyde Taylor called The Mask of Art, and I think one of his formulations, very stringent and hardcore kind of formulation, is that the very idea of art as a kind of separable, as a set of separable of entities which are separable from the activities, the social activities that produce them, that's a bad formulation. That's a formulation that we ought to be aware of, and you know, so. But see, I just love the music, you know. I love the records, and I love listening to the music, and I love reading books, and I love going to the museum, and I look at these works of art, you know, and I try to understand how it is that they are connected to the practices from which they emerge. And eventually, what it requires me to do is to kind of disbelieve, you know, in the very idea of the individual work of art, you know. And I think that in a lot of ways, Black art, the practice of Black art, goes against the grain of a kind of metaphysical belief in the idea of a singular work of art, you know. And this is something that I've been thinking about a lot, particularly by way of, you know, under the influence of my wife, Laura Harris, who works on these same questions too, and who knows a lot more about this stuff than me. What I'm trying to say is so you could put it this way. Yeah, if we listen to Ornette Coleman's free jazz or Coltrane's Ascension, you know, or the World Saxophone Quartet or something like that, we could say, yeah, this is what the Undercommons is like this, you know. But I would also want to suggest that two things. One, if we were listening to like, and this is an insight that is for me an Amiri Baraka insight that goes all the way back to this great famous essay he wrote in the 60s called The Changing Same, that what it is that we see or hear when we're listening to Train's Ascension is what we are also hearing and seeing when
That's
we
it
listen
for Africa
to,
World Now Project for this week. I would like to thank you for joining us today and look forward to spending time with you next week. We can be reached through all your regular social media platforms, email africaworldnowproject@gmail.com, or follow us on Twitter at AFWRLDNWPRJ. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. The Africa World Now Project Collective consists of international media journalist, executive producer, and human rights activist, Mwiza Muntali, Africa World Now Project media correspondent, Funda Ngunda, senior researcher and content contributor, Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui. Technology advisor is Byron Gray of Grayworks Technology, and creative director is Judah Pope. Africa World Now Project is heard every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on WSNC, NPR affiliate and broadcast service of Winston-Salem State University. Shows are archived weekly on SoundCloud. Search Africa World Now Project. Until next week, be safe, be peaceful, and above all, be intelligent.